Welcome to another exploration into the darker corners of American history, stories that remain as mysterious as they are unsettling. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. There are places in America where the earth itself seems to remember violence, where the soil holds secrets that time refuses to erase. In the heart of what would become Missouri, along a forgotten wilderness trail that connected the muddy waters of the Mississippi to the dark hollows of the Ozarks, one such place still whispers its terrible story to anyone who dares to listen. The year was 1799. George Washington had just died at Mount Vernon. The United States was barely a generation old, still finding its footing as a nation. And out on the western frontier, in the lawless expanse of the Missouri Territory, civilization was nothing more than a thin veneer stretched across an unforgiving wilderness. This was a land where a man could disappear without a trace, where justice traveled on horseback and arrived months too late, where the distance between towns could swallow screams whole. Along one particular stretch of the wilderness road, where the trail narrowed between limestone bluffs and dense stands of pine, travelers began to vanish with disturbing regularity. Not occasionally, as frontier hazards might explain, not in ones or twos during harsh winters when the elements could claim the unprepared, but systematically, deliberately, as if something in the hollow between the ridges was feeding on human passage. The locals called it Murder Hollow, though not for many years. At first, they had no name for it at all. They only knew that when a trader headed west toward the Arkansas country, when a family of settlers followed the rutted path toward new land, when a lone trapper guided his pack mules through that particular stretch of forest, there was a chance they would never emerge on the other side. Letters from St. Louis went unanswered. Goods expected at trading posts never arrived. Children waited for fathers who had promised to return by spring, watching the trail until snow covered it, then watching the next spring and the spring after that. This is not a ghost story. This is something far more disturbing. This is the documented account of what historians now believe to be one of America's first family murder cults, operating in plain sight on the edge of civilization, preying on the desperation and trust of strangers in a land where hospitality could mean the difference between life and death. The evidence exists in fragments: burned letters, water-stained court documents, testimonies recorded in the careful hand of territorial officials who could scarcely believe what they were hearing. The story has been buried by time, dismissed as frontier folklore, conflated with legend until the truth became almost impossible to separate from myth. But the truth is there, if you know where to look, and it is more terrifying than any legend could ever be. The Darnell family arrived in the White River Valley sometime in the late 1790s. No one could quite remember exactly when they first appeared, which in itself was unusual in a time and place where every new arrival was noteworthy, where settlers gathered to hear news from back east, where the addition of a single family could shift the social balance of an entire region. The Darnells seemed to materialize out of the wilderness itself, as if they had always been there, waiting in the hollow between the ridges. They were not a large family by frontier standards. Jacob Darnell, the patriarch, was described in the few records that mention him as a man of middle years with a hard face and harder eyes. His wife, Mary, was rarely seen by neighbors and almost never spoke when she was. They had 3 sons, ranging in age from perhaps 15 to 25, though exact ages were never recorded. Some accounts mention a daughter as well, though she appears so infrequently in the historical record that her existence remains uncertain, like a shadow glimpsed only in peripheral vision. What set the Darnells apart from other frontier families was not their appearance or their reticence, both common enough traits in that harsh landscape. It was their location. They had built their homestead in a spot that made no practical sense whatsoever. The hollow where they settled offered poor drainage, making cultivation difficult. Game was scarce in that particular stretch of forest, where the limestone bedrock broke through the soil in sharp ridges that made hunting treacherous. Water had to be hauled from a spring nearly half a mile distant, though they later dug a well that produced water described by visitors as having a strange metallic taste. The only advantage to their location was its position along the wilderness trail. The Darnell cabin sat at the narrowest point of the passage through the hills, where travelers had no choice but to pass within sight of their property. It was the last shelter before a difficult 3-day journey through territory where the trail became barely passable, where streams ran too high to ford in spring and froze solid in winter. Any traveler with sense would stop at the Darnells. If night was falling, if a storm was brewing, if exhaustion or injury had slowed their progress. And many travelers did stop. That was the beginning of their mistake. The Darnells quickly established themselves as a waypoint for those heading west. They offered food, shelter for the night, space in their barn for animals. The prices they charged were reasonable by frontier standards. Too reasonable, some later said, as if they were more interested in attracting guests than in making a profit. They never turned anyone away, no matter how late the hour, no matter how sudden the arrival. The door was always open. The fire was always burning. And Mary Darnell always had stew simmering in the iron pot that hung from a hook in their massive stone fireplace. French trappers who worked the streams in the region were the first to notice something wrong, though they couldn't quite articulate what it was. They described a feeling of being watched when they passed the Darnell property, though they never saw anyone observing them. They noted that smoke rose from the chimney at odd hours, thick and dark, carrying a smell that wasn't quite wood smoke. One trapper, a man named Levick who traded at the post in St. Louis, told the factor there that he had spent a night at the Darnells and had not slept at all. When asked why, he simply shook his head and said the family never blinked, that they sat around their table and watched him in the firelight with eyes that reflected the flames like an animal's eyes, and that he had kept his hand on his knife until dawn. But these were just feelings, just superstitions perhaps. The frontier was full of strange people, full of those who had fled civilization for reasons they didn't care to share. A family keeping to themselves, watching strangers with suspicion. These were not unusual traits in a place where trust could get you killed as easily as foolishness. The actual disappearances began to be noticed in 1802, though they may have been occurring for years before anyone connected them to a pattern. A pair of traders from Kaskaskia, Illinois, set out in March of that year with a string of mules loaded with iron goods, powder, and cloth. They were heading to the Spanish settlements in Arkansas, a journey that should have taken no more than 3 weeks. The trader who had outfitted them in Kaskaskia expected them to return by summer with furs and Spanish silver. Summer came and went. Fall arrived, then winter. The following spring he made inquiries. The traders had never reached Arkansas. No one in the Spanish settlements had ever heard of them. They had simply vanished somewhere along the trail. That same year, a family of settlers, the Pritchards, left St. Louis with their 3 children, bound for land they had claimed near the Black River. The territorial recorder had their claim on file. They had sold their property in Kentucky to make the move. They had said goodbye to relatives, promising to write once they were settled. Those letters never came. When a cousin traveled west 2 years later to find them, he discovered that they had never filed the improvements on their claim. The land stood empty, unworked, as if no one had ever intended to farm it at all. A circuit preacher vanished in 1803, a surveyor's assistant in 1804, 3 separate trappers in the winter of 1805, men experienced in wilderness travel, men who knew the country and could read weather and terrain like other men read books. Each disappearance had its own explanation, its own reasonable possibility. The frontier was dangerous. People got lost. They drowned in river crossings. They fell from bluffs. They ran afoul of hostile Indians, though the Osage in that region had been peaceful for years. They simply died, alone in the wilderness, as so many had before them. But the local settlers, the families who had carved out their farms and trading posts in that difficult country, began to see a pattern that official reports did not. They noticed that the disappearances clustered around one particular stretch of the trail. They noted that travelers who mentioned stopping at the Darnell's place were never heard from again, while those who pushed through to the next settlement, despite exhaustion or weather, always arrived safely. Whispers began in the trading posts and at church gatherings, quiet conversations that stopped when strangers approached. The Darnell name became something that people were reluctant to speak aloud, as if saying it might draw attention, might make you the next one to vanish on that stretch of lonely trail. In the summer of 1804, a drifter named William Hutchins arrived in the small settlement of Potosi, Missouri, with a story that turned whispers into accusations. Hutchins was a man of uncertain origins and questionable character, the type who wandered the frontier taking work where he could find it, staying just ahead of whatever trouble had chased him from the last place. He was not the sort whose testimony would normally be taken seriously, but what he carried with him demanded attention. Hutchins claimed he had spent 3 nights at the Darnell homestead the previous month, working off the cost of his stay by helping Jacob Darnell repair his barn. The work was grueling, Hutchins said, and the family was strange in ways that made his skin crawl. They spoke to each other in looks rather than words. They moved around their property with a coordination that suggested they were following a routine they had practiced many times before, and they watched him constantly, even when they appeared to be engaged in other tasks. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep in the oppressive atmosphere of the Darnell cabin, Hutchins had risen in the darkness and stepped outside. He noticed a light in the barn, which struck him as odd given the late hour. Moving closer, he heard voices, low and urgent. Through a gap in the barn wall, he saw the entire Darnell family gathered around something he couldn't quite make out in the dim lantern light. They appeared to be digging, moving earth from one place to another with a systematic efficiency that spoke of long practice. Hutchins had crept back to the cabin, but sleep was impossible. He lay in the darkness, listening to the family return one by one, hearing them move around in the main room with that same eerie coordination. At first light, he had left without saying goodbye, without even collecting the small payment Darnell had promised for his work. But he hadn't left empty-handed. Driven by a curiosity he later admitted was probably foolish, Hutchins had done some exploring of the property before departing. In a lean-to attached to the cabin, beneath a pile of old straw and empty feed sacks, he had found a book. Not a Bible or a farmer's almanac, the sort of books you might expect to find in a frontier home. This was a ledger, the kind merchants used to track accounts and inventory. The ledger Hutchins carried to Potosi was water-stained and fire-damaged, its cover blackened as if someone had tried to burn it. But enough remained to be legible, and what it contained sent cold dread through everyone who saw it. Page after page contained names, dates, and brief descriptions. March 17, 1801, 2 men, iron goods, mules, $40 silver. September 2, 1801, family of 5, wagon, household goods, $120 estimated. November 11, 1802, single man, trapper, furs, $30 goods. Each entry was followed by a single word, written in a different hand, as if someone else had added it later. The word was always the same, settled. The ledger contained more than 40 such entries. Some of the names matched travelers who had been reported missing. Others were unfamiliar, suggesting disappearances that had never even been reported, people who had no one waiting for them, no one to notice when they failed to arrive at their destination. The dates stretched back to 1799, the year the Darnells had first appeared in the valley. Hutchins told the settlers in Potosi that he believed the Darnells were murdering travelers and stealing their goods. The ledger was their record, a tally of their crimes kept with the same careful attention a merchant might give to legitimate business. He urged them to send word to the territorial authorities in St. Louis to organize a posse to investigate before anyone else vanished. The response was complicated. Some believed Hutchins immediately and wanted to ride to the Darnell place that very day. Others were skeptical. Hutchins was a known drifter, possibly a thief himself. The ledger could be a forgery, something he had created to deflect suspicion from his own crimes. And even if the ledger was real, it proved nothing definitively. The entries could be legitimate business transactions, the word settled merely indicating that accounts had been paid. While the settlers debated, Hutchins made the mistake of getting drunk at a trading post and talking too freely about what he had found. Within a week, before any official investigation could be organized, Hutchins disappeared. His few possessions were found at his campsite outside Potosi, suggesting he had left in a hurry or been taken by force. The ledger, which had been in the possession of a local farmer who was planning to take it to St. Louis, vanished the same night. A week later, a fire destroyed the old Darnell cabin. Travelers passing through the hollow found only a burned foundation, still smoldering. The barn had been taken apart, its timbers removed as if salvaged for use elsewhere. The well had been filled with stones. The property was abandoned, the Darnell family nowhere to be found. It was as if they had simply evaporated, leaving behind only ashes and questions. But something else was found in the ruins, something that couldn't be explained away or dismissed as coincidence. When the ashes cooled enough to search, settlers discovered melted silver in the hearth, pooled around the stones in irregular shapes that suggested it had been jewelry or coins before the intense heat had destroyed its form. And wedged into the foundation, partially fused to the limestone by the fire's heat, was a human finger bone with a gold ring still circling its charred remnant. The discovery galvanized the territorial authorities in a way that rumors and missing persons reports had not. Physical evidence demanded action. In September of 1805, Territorial Marshal Henry Givens was dispatched from St. Louis with instructions to investigate the disappearances and locate the Darnell family for questioning. Henry Givens was not a man prone to superstition or flights of fancy. He had served as a marshal in Kentucky before taking the position in Missouri Territory, and he had seen his share of frontier violence. Claim jumpers, river pirates, murderers who thought distance from civilization gave them immunity from law. He approached the Darnell case with the same methodical attention he brought to any investigation, gathering statements from settlers, examining what remained of the burned homestead, tracking down anyone who had ever had dealings with the family. The picture that emerged from his investigation was deeply disturbing. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the Darnells in possession of goods that matched the descriptions of items that had belonged to missing travelers. A saddle with distinctive silver conchos, last seen on a horse ridden by a trader who vanished in 1803. A Pennsylvania rifle with a brass name plate, which had belonged to a surveyor's assistant who never returned from a mapping expedition. Women's jewelry that seemed far too fine for a frontier farmer's wife to afford. When questioned about these items, the Darnells had always had explanations. They had purchased the saddle from a trapper whose name they couldn't quite recall. The rifle had been traded for work. The jewelry was a family heirloom, and perhaps these explanations would have been accepted, might have explained away the suspicions, except for one problem. No one could locate the Darnells to question them about anything. The family had disappeared as thoroughly as their victims. Givens traced rumors of their whereabouts across the territory. They had been seen in Arkansas, or maybe it was Kentucky. Someone thought they had headed north into Iowa country. Another report placed them in Texas, settling on Spanish land where American law couldn't follow. But every lead evaporated when Givens pursued it. The Darnells had vanished like smoke, and the only thing they had left behind was the burned foundation of their cabin and a growing list of questions that had no answers. Givens spent weeks at the site of the Darnell homestead, directing a crew of local men in a detailed search of the property. What they found there would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. The filled well was the first thing they excavated. It took 2 days to remove the stones that had been carefully stacked inside, stones that showed signs of tool marks, suggesting this had been a deliberate effort to hide something rather than simple abandonment. When they finally reached the bottom, 30 feet down into the earth, they found why it had been sealed. The water at the bottom of the well had a reddish tinge that didn't come from minerals. Scattered across the stone floor, mixed with the mud and debris of years, were human remains. Not complete skeletons, but fragments, pieces that had been dismembered and discarded like butcher's scraps. The men who went down into that well emerged pale and shaking, refusing to speak about what they had seen in detail, saying only that it was clear many bodies had been disposed of in that dark shaft. But the well was just the beginning. The earth around the barn foundation, which Givens noted had been turned as if by many hands, revealed more graves when they dug test pits at intervals across the property. Shallow graves, barely 3 feet deep, containing remains in various states of decay. Some were recent enough that clothing fragments remained. Others had been in the ground long enough that only bones survived, picked clean by the soil and whatever lived in it. The investigation uncovered at least 15 separate burial sites over the course of 3 weeks. Given the size of the property and the limited resources available for excavation, Givens noted in his report that there were likely many more that remained undiscovered. The pattern of the graves suggested a system, a method to the disposal that spoke of practice and planning. Bodies had been placed in locations where the Darnells could keep track of them, buried near property boundaries and along fence lines, as if they were marking out their territory with the dead. The physical evidence was damning, but it was what Givens found inside the ruins of the cabin that transformed the investigation from a frontier murder case into something that defied rational explanation. Beneath the burned floorboards in a shallow depression that had been dug into the earth and lined with stones, they discovered a second ledger. This one had been protected from the fire by its burial, though water damage had made some pages illegible. The ledger was similar to the one Hutchins had found, but more extensive and far more detailed. It contained not just names and estimated values, but careful descriptions of how each victim had been killed, where they had been buried, and what use had been made of their possessions. The handwriting was meticulous, almost artistic in its careful formation of letters. Someone had taken pride in keeping this record, had treated it like a family Bible or a treasured document worth preserving. But it was the other things written in the margins that made the ledger truly horrifying. Scattered throughout the pages were phrases and sentences that suggested the murders weren't simply crimes of opportunity, weren't just about theft and profit. The hollow requires payment. The land takes what it is owed. Sacrifice ensures prosperity. These cryptic notations appeared throughout the ledger, written in the same careful hand as the rest, as if they were simply another category of information to be recorded. Givens copied the legible portions of the ledger into his official report, though he noted that he found the contents so disturbing as to strain credulity. He struggled to reconcile the methodical record-keeping with the apparent belief system that justified the murders. Were the Darnells simply thieves who had created a bizarre philosophy to excuse their crimes? Or had they genuinely believed they were performing some kind of ritual obligation, feeding the hollow with human lives in exchange for some imagined reward? The investigation expanded to include interviews with anyone who had ever interacted with the Darnell family. A picture emerged of people who had been preparing for their crimes long before they committed them. Jacob Darnell had purchased supplies in St. Louis on multiple occasions, always paying in a mixture of coins, silver, and trade goods that seemed inconsistent with the income of a small frontier farm. He had been seen talking to travelers in taverns, casually asking about their destinations and expected arrival times, information that would have allowed him to know when someone might be missed. Mary Darnell, the wife who had seemed so quiet and withdrawn, was described by one visiting missionary as having the eyes of one who had seen terrible things and participated in them without remorse. Father Toussaint, a Catholic priest who had spent a night at the Darnell cabin during a thunderstorm in 1803, wrote in his journal that the family had offered him hospitality but had watched him throughout the night with an intensity that suggested they were waiting for something. He had kept his crucifix in his hand until dawn, he wrote, though he couldn't explain why he felt the need for such protection. In retrospect, Father Toussaint believed he had survived only because killing a priest would have brought too much attention, would have triggered exactly the kind of investigation that was now underway. The Darnell sons remain the most mysterious. Few people could even agree on how many there had been, with estimates ranging from 2 to 4. They were described as silent, coordinated, moving around their property like a single organism with multiple bodies. One witness claimed to have seen them carrying something heavy from the barn to the well in the middle of the night, working in perfect unison without needing to speak. Another reported watching them dig a hole near the property line, their shovels rising and falling in exact synchronization, as if they were performing a rehearsed routine. By December of 1805, Givens had compiled enough evidence to issue a formal warrant for the arrest of Jacob Darnell and his family on multiple counts of murder and robbery. But the warrant was meaningless if the suspects couldn't be found. Givens sent copies of his report to every territorial authority in the region, to military posts, to Spanish officials in Texas, to anyone who might encounter the Darnells and recognize them. He offered a reward for information leading to their capture, funded by the territorial government and supplemented by donations from families of the missing. Months passed with no credible sightings. Then, in March of 1806, a break came from an unexpected direction. A trapper bringing furs to the post at Arkansas Post reported seeing a man matching Jacob Darnell's description crossing the Arkansas River near the Texas boundary. The man had been with a group of rough-looking individuals, possibly family members, and they had been heading west into Comanche territory, where American authorities had no jurisdiction and no hope of following. But this sighting was followed by another report, this one from a military patrol operating near the Missouri-Arkansas border. They had encountered a young man attempting to steal supplies from their camp. When caught, he had fought with a ferocity that seemed disproportionate to the crime. During the struggle, one of the soldiers had noticed distinctive scars on the man's hands, burned scars that covered his palms and fingers, scars that might have come from handling hot metal or working around a forge, or from disposing of evidence in a fire. Under questioning, the young man initially refused to give his name, claiming to be an orphan who had been living rough in the wilderness. But his story fell apart under scrutiny. He was too well fed to have been living off the land. His clothes, though dirty, were of good quality and showed signs of careful mending. And most tellingly, he carried items that didn't belong to a person of his supposed circumstances. A silver watch, a Pennsylvania rifle, a leather pouch containing gold coins. When confronted with the evidence and threatened with hanging as a thief, the young man finally broke. His name was Samuel Darnell, he said, and he was the youngest son of Jacob Darnell. His family had fled when they learned that their crimes had been discovered, had abandoned their homestead and scattered in different directions to avoid capture. Samuel had become separated from the others while crossing the Arkansas River, and he had been surviving on his own for months, slowly making his way west to join his family in Texas. Samuel Darnell's confession, given in late March of 1806 and recorded by a territorial judge, provided details about the Darnell family's crimes that matched the physical evidence Givens had uncovered. But it also introduced elements that were even more disturbing than what the investigation had revealed. According to Samuel, the murders had begun before the family even arrived in Missouri. Jacob Darnell had killed a man in Tennessee over a property dispute and had fled west with his family to escape prosecution. But instead of reforming or laying low, Jacob had seen the frontier as an opportunity. The wilderness trails were full of vulnerable travelers, and there was no law to stop a man who was willing to exploit that vulnerability. The family had discussed the idea of murder for profit even before they selected the location for their homestead, had chosen the narrow hollow specifically because it was an ideal place to intercept travelers. The Darnells had developed a system for selecting victims. They never targeted large groups, which would have been too difficult to overpower and too likely to include someone with the skill to fight back effectively. They never killed people who were expected at specific destinations within a few days, knowing that such disappearances would prompt immediate searches. Instead, they focused on lone travelers, small families, people who were heading to distant locations or who had no firm ties to communities that would miss them quickly. The method of killing varied depending on the circumstances, Samuel said, but it always involved surprise and overwhelming force. Sometimes the victims were killed in their sleep, after the Darnells had offered hospitality and waited for exhaustion to make them vulnerable. Other times they were lured away from the cabin under some pretext, a request for help with an animal or assistance with a broken wagon, and killed out of sight of any witnesses. The bodies were quickly searched for valuables, then dismembered to make burial easier and discovery less likely. But it was what Samuel said about his father's beliefs that truly chilled those who heard his testimony. Jacob Darnell had convinced his family that the murders were not just profitable but necessary. He claimed that the hollow where they had built their homestead was a special place, a location where the barrier between the living world and something else was thin. The land demanded payment, he told them, demanded blood and bone to remain fertile, to keep the family safe, to ensure their prosperity. Every person they killed was a sacrifice, a tithe paid to forces that Samuel couldn't or wouldn't name in his confession. Whether Jacob Darnell genuinely believed this mystical justification, or whether it was simply a way to manipulate his family into participating in his crimes, Samuel couldn't say. But he insisted that his father had performed rituals over some of the bodies before burial, had spoken words in a language Samuel didn't recognize, had placed stones and branches in patterns that were supposed to have significance. The second ledger, the one found beneath the cabin floor, was not just a record but a sacred text, a documentation of the family's offerings to whatever power Jacob believed inhabited the hollow. Samuel's confession provided enough detail to close several missing persons cases and gave investigators a clear picture of how the Darnell family had operated. But it also raised difficult questions. Samuel claimed he had participated in the murders reluctantly, that his father had threatened him and his brothers with violence if they refused, that he had been as much a victim as a perpetrator. He wept as he gave his testimony, begged for mercy, insisted that he wanted to help the authorities locate his father and brothers to prevent them from killing anyone else. The territorial judge who presided over Samuel's case faced a dilemma. The young man was clearly guilty of multiple murders, crimes that carried a death sentence under territorial law. But he was also the only source of information about the rest of the Darnell family, the only one who might be able to lead authorities to Jacob and the others before they established themselves in a new location and resumed their killing. Additionally, there was genuine question about Samuel's culpability. He had been raised by a father who preached murder as religious duty, had known no other life than one that involved killing travelers. Was he truly guilty in the way an adult who chose to commit murder would be, or was he more akin to a child soldier, someone who had been indoctrinated into violence before he was old enough to resist? The decision was made to postpone Samuel's execution in exchange for his cooperation. He would help identify his father and brothers, would provide descriptions and information about where they might have fled. If his assistance led to the capture of the rest of the family, his sentence might be commuted to life imprisonment. If he failed to cooperate or was found to be lying, he would hang within the month. Samuel agreed to these terms, and in April of 1806, he accompanied a military expedition into the borderlands between Missouri and Arkansas, searching for any trace of his family. The expedition lasted 6 weeks and covered hundreds of miles of difficult terrain. They interviewed settlers, checked with trading posts, followed every rumor and report, but they found nothing. The rest of the Darnell family had vanished completely, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. The expedition returned to the military post in May, having failed in its primary objective. A decision had to be made about Samuel's fate. The military commander in charge of the expedition wrote in his report that he believed Samuel had cooperated in good faith, that the young man genuinely didn't know where his family had gone, and that holding him further would serve no purpose. But the territorial judge disagreed. Samuel Darnell had confessed to participating in multiple murders. The law demanded justice for those crimes, regardless of the circumstances that had produced them. In June of 1806, Samuel Darnell was executed by hanging at the territorial capital. He was 19 years old, according to records, though there was some dispute about his exact age. His last words were reported to be a warning, a claim that his father was still out there, still killing, and that the authorities would never catch him because the hollow protects its own. What exactly he meant by this cryptic statement was never clarified, and most observers dismissed it as the rambling of a young man facing death. Samuel's body was buried in an unmarked grave, as was customary for executed criminals. And with his death, the official investigation into the Darnell murders effectively ended. The rest of the family was still at large, but resources were limited, and there were other cases demanding attention. Marshal Givens continued to pursue leads for another year, but gradually the search was abandoned. The Darnells had escaped justice, at least in this life. But the story didn't end with Samuel's execution. In fact, in many ways, it was just beginning. In the months and years following the discovery of the Darnell murders, something strange happened in the hollow where the family had lived. Settlers who had been eager to claim the property, attracted by its position along the trail and the improvements the Darnells had made, began to report unusual experiences. Animals refused to graze on the land. Horses would balk at crossing the property line, had to be forced with whips and spurs to continue along the trail. Dogs would growl at empty air, hackles raised, as if something invisible moved through the abandoned homestead. Travelers who camped near the old Darnell place reported hearing sounds in the night. The ring of metal on metal, as if someone was working with tools in the darkness. Voices speaking in low tones, too indistinct to make out words but clear enough to distinguish multiple speakers. Footsteps crunching through fallen leaves, circling their camps but never approaching close enough to be seen. Most travelers pushed on rather than spending the night in the hollow, even if it meant traveling in darkness over difficult terrain. The few people who did attempt to settle on the Darnell property never stayed long. A farmer named Peters tried to establish a homestead there in 1807, attracted by the cleared land and the stone foundation that could be rebuilt. He lasted 3 weeks before abandoning the property and refusing to discuss what had driven him away. A trader attempted to build a way station there in 1809, thinking the location would be perfect for servicing travelers. The building he started was never completed. Workers complained of tools going missing, of cold spots in the summer heat, of a feeling of being watched constantly by hostile eyes. By 1810, the property was considered cursed by most settlers in the region. No one would buy it, no one would work it, and the trail that had once run directly past the Darnell cabin was gradually rerouted to avoid the hollow entirely. It was easier to ford an extra stream and climb an additional ridge than to pass through that place, where the very air seemed heavy with malevolence. But the strange occurrences weren't limited to the hollow itself. Throughout the region, there were reports that seemed to suggest the Darnells, or someone inspired by their crimes, were still active. Travelers continued to disappear along the frontier trails, though never again in the concentrated pattern that had marked the Darnell killings. Sometimes the bodies were found, bearing signs of violence that matched the Darnells' methods. Other times there was simply absence, people who left one place heading for another and never arrived. In 1812, a settler in the Arkansas Territory reported seeing a man who matched Jacob Darnell's description. The man was living with a family in an isolated cabin, was calling himself by another name, but the settler swore it was the same person whose face he had seen on wanted posters years earlier. By the time authorities investigated, the cabin was abandoned and its occupants gone. A search of the property revealed nothing incriminating, but nearby they found a single grave, badly concealed, containing the remains of a young woman who had been reported missing from a settlement 50 miles away. Similar reports came from Texas, from Louisiana, from the wild lands of Kentucky and Tennessee. Always the pattern was the same: a suspicious family living in isolation, offering hospitality to travelers, and a trail of disappearances that seemed to follow them. Were these actually the Darnells, still practicing the murder trade that Jacob had perfected in Missouri? Or were they copycats, people who had heard the stories and decided to emulate the crimes? The authorities had no way to know, no way to pursue every lead across hundreds of miles of frontier wilderness. What is certain is that the Darnell case became legendary in the region, a cautionary tale told to travelers to warn them about the dangers of trusting strangers. Parents told their children about the hollow where a family had killed dozens, maybe hundreds, using the story to teach lessons about the darkness that could hide behind a friendly face. The tale grew in the telling, acquired embellishments and supernatural elements, until it was difficult to separate the documented facts from the folklore that had accumulated around them. In 1821, with Missouri's statehood imminent, the Springfield Journal published an article attempting to demystify the Darnell legend. The writer, who signed himself only as a friend to truth, argued that the murders had been exaggerated by superstition and frontier hysteria. The actual number of victims, he claimed, was probably fewer than a dozen, not the dozens or hundreds that were rumored. The strange occurrences at the hollow were simply the result of suggestion and fear, tricks of perception that frightened minds interpreted as supernatural. The Darnells had been criminals, certainly, but they were not the inhuman monsters that legend had made them. The article was reasoned, carefully argued, and backed by references to court documents and official reports. It should have been convincing. But even the author admitted that he had refused an offer to visit the hollow where the Darnells had lived, choosing instead to research the case from the comfort of towns and settlements. And tellingly, in the final paragraph of his article, he noted that while he believed the supernatural elements of the story were false, he advised travelers to avoid the hollow nonetheless, as a precaution against whatever dangers, natural or otherwise, may still reside in that unfortunate place. The early 19th century saw a flourishing of interest in the Darnell case among academics and folklorists. As the frontier became more settled, as law and order replaced the chaos of the territorial period, people felt safe enough to examine the horrors that had occurred in the wilderness years. The Darnell murders became a subject of study, analyzed for what they revealed about frontier psychology, about the breakdown of social norms in isolated communities, about the capacity of humans to justify monstrous acts. Dr. Hiram Kell, a professor of history at a newly established college in Missouri, made the Darnell case the subject of a detailed study published in 1847. Kell had the advantage of access to documents that had been locked in territorial archives for decades, including the complete text of Samuel Darnell's confession and Marshall Given's investigative reports. He also conducted interviews with elderly settlers who had been young adults during the time of the murders, gathering first-hand accounts of the Darnells and the atmosphere of fear they had created. Kell's study was notable for its attempt to place the Darnell case in a broader context of American frontier violence. He documented similar cases from other regions, families or small groups who had preyed on travelers, murder-for-profit schemes that had operated for years before being discovered. The Darnells were not unique, Kell argued, but they were perhaps the most successful, operating longer and claiming more victims than any other case he had found. What made the Darnells different, according to Kell's analysis, was the ritualistic element of their crimes. Other frontier murderers had killed for practical reasons, for money and goods. But Jacob Darnell appeared to have developed or adopted a belief system that transformed murder into something more than theft, that gave it religious or mystical significance. This psychological element, Kell believed, was what had allowed the family to continue killing for so many years without remorse, and what made them particularly dangerous compared to ordinary criminals. Backel's study also documented something that had puzzled investigators from the beginning: the physical peculiarities of the Darnell property. During his research, Kell had actually visited the hollow, bringing with him a surveyor and a geologist to examine the site. What they found was deeply strange. The soil in the immediate vicinity of the Darnell homestead had properties that defied easy explanation. It was harder than the surrounding earth, almost mineralized, as if something had caused the clay and organic matter to fuse into a substance more like soft stone. The geologist Kell consulted suggested that this might be the result of intense heat, though there was no evidence of a fire large enough to affect such a broad area. The surveyor noted that the ground in certain locations, particularly near where graves had been excavated, showed subsidence patterns that suggested there were voids beneath the surface, cavities in the earth that hadn't been there when the Darnells first settled. Most disturbing was the well. Though it had been filled with stones in 1805, Kell's team found that the stones had settled significantly, creating a depression that suggested the shaft was collapsing from below. When they attempted to probe the depth of the remaining shaft, they found it extended far deeper than 30 feet, far deeper than any well needed to go to reach water in that region. The probe touched bottom at approximately 60 feet, twice the depth Marshall Givens had recorded. Either the original excavation had failed to find the true bottom, or the shaft had somehow deepened in the intervening years. Kell reported these findings in an appendix to his main study, noting that they were curiosities worthy of further investigation by those more qualified in matters of geology and natural philosophy. But he also admitted that the experience of visiting the hollow had unsettled him in ways that scientific observation couldn't fully address. The place felt wrong, he wrote, in a way that was difficult to articulate but impossible to ignore. Even decades after the Darnells had fled, even with the physical evidence of their crimes removed or buried, the property retained an atmosphere of menace that affected everyone who visited it. Kell's study sparked renewed interest in the Darnell case and prompted other researchers to investigate. Several attempted to locate the remaining members of the Darnell family, following the scattered reports of sightings that had accumulated over the years. But every lead ended in frustration. The Darnells had either died in the wilderness, had been killed by Indians or disease, or had successfully hidden themselves in communities where no one knew their history. They had vanished as completely as their victims, leaving behind only questions and legends. One researcher, a journalist named Patterson, claimed in 1852 that he had located Jacob Darnell living under an assumed name in Texas. The man Patterson identified was the right age, had physical characteristics that matched descriptions, and lived in isolation in a manner consistent with the Darnells' pattern. But when Patterson attempted to confirm his identification, the man and his family had abandoned their property and disappeared. A search revealed nothing definitive, though Patterson noted in his report that the man's property included a well of unusual depth, and that neighbors had reported travelers occasionally going missing in that area. Whether this was actually Jacob Darnell or simply another frontier murderer inspired by the Missouri crimes remained an open question. The authorities declined to pursue the matter further, partly due to the difficulty of prosecuting crimes committed decades earlier in another jurisdiction, and partly because there was simply no way to prove the man's identity. The Darnells had escaped into the vast anonymity of the frontier, and the likelihood of ever bringing them to justice diminished with each passing year. By the 1860s, the Darnell murders had passed from recent history into folklore, had become a story told around campfires and at tavern tables. The details changed in the retelling. Some versions claimed the Darnells had killed hundreds. Others said Jacob Darnell had made a pact with the devil, that he had sold his soul in exchange for the power to make travelers trust him. More elaborate versions describe the hollow as a gateway to hell itself, claimed that the Darnells weren't killing their victims but feeding them to something that lived beneath the earth. These fantastical elaborations obscured the documented truth, but they also served a purpose. They kept the memory of the crimes alive, ensured that travelers remained cautious, that the dangers of the frontier weren't forgotten even as those dangers were gradually eliminated by settlement and law. The legend of the Darnells became a collective memory of a time when the wilderness was genuinely threatening, when isolation could be deadly, when evil could operate openly because there was no one to stop it. The Civil War brought renewed attention to the region, as military forces moved through Missouri and Arkansas. Soldiers occasionally camped in areas that included the old Darnell property, and their letters and diaries sometimes mentioned the hollow and its reputation. Most dismissed the stories as superstition, but a few recorded experiences that suggested the place still had the power to unnerve even hardened military men. A Union officer wrote in 1863 that his company had attempted to camp in the hollow during a march, only to have their horses panic in the night, breaking their tethers and scattering into the surrounding forest. The men reported hearing sounds like digging, like metal striking stone, though searches revealed no one else in the area. The officer ordered the company to move to a new campsite rather than spend another night in the hollow, noting in his diary that some places carry the memory of evil in their very soil, and wise men avoid them regardless of convenience. A Confederate scouting party supposedly spent a night near the old Darnell well in 1864 and reported seeing lights moving through the hollow in the darkness, as if someone was carrying a lantern from place to place. When they investigated in the morning, they found disturbed earth and what appeared to be freshly dug pits, though whether these were connected to the Darnell murders or were simply the result of wartime activity in the area was never determined. After the war, as the nation slowly rebuilt and the frontier was pushed further west, the hollow gradually lost its sinister reputation among all but the oldest residents of the region. New generations arrived who had never heard of the Darnells, who saw the hollow as simply another patch of Missouri woodland. The trail that had once run past the property was abandoned entirely, as roads were built through the area, following different routes dictated by the needs of wagons and eventually automobiles. The physical traces of the Darnell homestead disappeared beneath undergrowth and erosion, until there was nothing left to mark where the cabin had stood except a few foundation stones and the depression where the well had been. But the hollow never became completely ordinary. Local hunters still avoided it, claiming that game was scarce there and that the terrain was more difficult than it was worth. Loggers who worked the surrounding forests always stopped short of the hollow, finding reasons to fell trees elsewhere, even when valuable timber stood unused on the old Darnell land. Children were told not to play there, though by the late 19th century, few adults could explain why except to say that it had always been forbidden, that their parents had told them the same thing, going back as far as anyone could remember. In 1897, nearly a century after the Darnells had first arrived in the hollow, a development company from St. Louis attempted to purchase the property as part of a larger tract they planned to turn into farmland and orchards. The sale was proceeding normally until the surveying crew refused to complete their work. They had started marking out boundaries and taking measurements, but after spending several days on the property, they packed their equipment and left, forfeiting their pay rather than continue. The crew chief reported to the development company that the property was unsuitable for development due to soil instability, though colleagues later said he had privately admitted the real reason was that the crew had been frightened by something they experienced in the hollow, something they couldn't or wouldn't describe in official reports. The development deal collapsed, and the property remained unused. By the turn of the 20th century, most people in the region didn't even know the hollow's history. The name Darnell appeared in local history books and in academic studies, but these were specialist materials, not common knowledge. The murders had faded from collective memory, survived only in occasional references in scholarly journals and in the vague discomfort that longtime residents felt when discussing that particular stretch of Missouri woodland. But then, in the early 1900s, something happened that brought the Darnell case back into public consciousness. A series of murders occurred in Missouri and Arkansas that bore striking similarities to the original Darnell killings. Travelers on isolated roads were disappearing. Bodies, when found, showed signs of having been killed by someone with knowledge of anatomy, someone who knew how to efficiently dismember remains for disposal. And in several cases, investigators found evidence that suggested the murders were being committed by a family or close-knit group, not by a lone killer. The press drew immediate parallels to the Darnell case, with newspapers running stories about the return of the murder clan. Historians were consulted to provide background on the original crimes. Police departments across the region reviewed their old case files, looking for connections that might link the new murders to unsolved disappearances from previous decades. There was widespread speculation that descendants of the Darnells might be continuing the family tradition of murder, that the knowledge and methods had been passed down through generations. The investigation into these new murders lasted for 3 years and involved law enforcement from multiple states. Dozens of suspects were interviewed, numerous properties searched, countless leads pursued. But in the end, no definitive connection to the original Darnells was ever established. The new murders appeared to be the work of a separate group, possibly inspired by the legends of the Darnell clan but not directly related to them. The killers were eventually captured and executed, and the case was closed without ever resolving the question of whether the original Darnell family had truly disappeared or whether some thread of their legacy continued. The renewed publicity brought scholars and curiosity seekers to the Hollow once again. A young anthropologist from Chicago visited in 1908, hoping to conduct an archaeological survey of the site. She spent 2 days attempting to locate the exact position of the Darnell cabin and to identify other features of the original homestead. Her published report was brief and curiously unsatisfying. She confirmed the location of the foundation and the filled well, noted the strange quality of the soil that earlier observers had mentioned, and then abandoned her survey without completing it. In a private letter to her faculty advisor, she admitted that she had found the work impossible to continue, not because of any physical difficulty, but because of an atmosphere of such oppressive malevolence that rational thought became difficult and objective observation impossible. This pattern repeated itself over the following decades. Multiple researchers attempted to study the Darnell property using increasingly sophisticated archaeological and forensic methods. Almost all abandoned their work before completion. Those who persisted and completed their surveys invariably reported feeling uneasy during their time in the Hollow, experiencing vivid nightmares while camping nearby, or suffering from unexplained anxiety that disappeared as soon as they left the area. A forensic team from a major university attempted to excavate the old well in 1934, hoping that modern techniques might reveal remains that had been missed in the original investigation. They managed to remove the stones and debris down to a depth of about 40 feet before the excavation was halted. The official reason given was that the cost of continuing was prohibitive, and that the historical value of whatever might be found didn't justify the expense. But members of the team later admitted that the real reason was that none of them could continue working in the shaft. The feeling of being watched, of something waiting in the darkness below, had become overwhelming. One team member had refused to descend into the well after the second day, claiming he could hear voices calling to him from the depths, voices that spoke names he recognized as belonging to the Darnell's victims. The well was filled in again, and a concrete cap was placed over it to prevent anyone else from attempting to excavate. The cap remains there today, cracked and weathered, but still marking the location of the shaft that had served as a tomb for so many of the Darnell's victims. World War II brought an influx of new residents to the region as military bases and manufacturing facilities were established. These newcomers had no knowledge of the area's history and no reason to avoid the hollow. Several attempted to use the property, either camping there during hunting trips or exploring it out of curiosity. Most had unremarkable experiences, finding nothing more sinister than an overgrown patch of Missouri woodland. But a few reported encounters that suggested something of the hollow's old reputation might be deserved. A group of soldiers on leave camped near the filled well in 1943. They reported hearing tapping sounds in the night, rhythmic and persistent, as if someone was hammering metal or striking stone. The sound seemed to come from beneath the ground, and they continued until dawn. One soldier, digging in the area where the sounds had been loudest, claimed to have found bones a few inches below the surface, though these were never officially examined or confirmed. A pair of hunters got lost in the hollow in 1946 and spent the night huddled beneath a rock outcropping. In the morning, they found what appeared to be a path worn into the earth, a depression that circled the area where the Darnell cabin had stood. The path was clearly old, the vegetation grown over it disturbed only by its slightly sunken profile. But what disturbed the hunters was the realization that they had followed this path in the darkness without knowing it existed, had walked in a circle around the old homestead, as if guided by something they couldn't see. These incidents were isolated, unusual enough to be remarked upon but not frequent enough to create any sustained interest. The hollow returned to obscurity, became once again just another patch of Ozark woodland that happened to have an unusually dark history. But the hollow's story was not quite finished. In the late 20th century, as interest in true crime and historical mysteries grew, the Darnell case was rediscovered by a new generation of researchers and enthusiasts. Books were written examining the murders from criminological and psychological perspectives. Television documentaries attempted to piece together the story using modern forensic understanding and criminal profiling. Online forums debated the details of the case, shared theories about what had happened to the surviving Darnells, and occasionally organized expeditions to visit the site of the original homestead. These modern examinations of the case brought new attention to aspects that earlier investigators had dismissed or overlooked. Forensic psychologists analyzing Samuel Darnell's confession noted elements consistent with ritual abuse, suggesting that Jacob Darnell had used religious or mystical beliefs not just to justify the murders, but to psychologically control his family. Criminologists pointed out that the methodical record-keeping in the ledgers indicated a level of organization rare in serial killers of that era, suggesting that Jacob Darnell might have had a more sophisticated criminal mind than frontier accounts had recognized. A particularly detailed study published in 1987 by a professor of criminal justice attempted to calculate the likely number of victims based on the documented evidence and reasonable extrapolations. The author concluded that the Darnells had probably killed between 30 and 50 people during their time in the hollow, possibly more if the family had been active before arriving in Missouri, as Samuel had suggested in his confession. This made the Darnells one of the most prolific murder families in American history, comparable to better-known cases like the Bloody Benders of Kansas, though operating 2 generations earlier and in much more primitive conditions. Modern visitors to the hollow find little to see. The foundation stones have mostly been scattered or buried. The well, capped with concrete in the 1930s, is nearly invisible beneath decades of leaf litter and erosion. There are no markers, no historical plaques, nothing to indicate that one of America's most horrific crime scenes lies hidden beneath the peaceful woodland. Local historical societies have occasionally discussed the possibility of creating some kind of memorial or interpretive site, but these proposals have always been quietly abandoned, as if some lingering superstition still makes people reluctant to draw attention to the place. The forest has reclaimed the hollow entirely, has hidden the scars that human evil left on the landscape. Trees grow where the Darnell cabin once stood, Deer graze in clearings that once saw unspeakable violence. The trail that brought so many travelers to their doom has long since disappeared, replaced by modern roads that bypass the hollow entirely. To a casual observer, there is nothing here but trees and rocks and the quiet emptiness of the deep woods. But those who know the history, who understand what happened here 2 centuries ago, often report a feeling that the hollow is not quite empty, not quite peaceful. That something in the earth remembers, even if human memory has faded. That the weight of those crimes has soaked into the soil itself, has become part of the place in a way that time cannot erase. Hunters still avoid the hollow, though when asked why, most can't articulate a reason beyond a vague sense that game is scarce there, or that the terrain is too difficult. Local teenagers sometimes dare each other to spend the night near the old Darnell property, though few actually do so, and those who try rarely stay until dawn. Hikers who stumble into the hollow without knowing its history often report feeling uneasy, feeling watched, feeling an inexplicable urge to leave despite the fact that there's nothing obviously threatening about the location. Are these experiences real, or are they simply the power of suggestion, the human mind creating fear where there is nothing to fear? Do the strange reports from the hollow reflect some genuine property of the place, some way that violence and death have altered it in a manner that sensitive individuals can perceive? Or are they just stories, legends built on the foundation of historical horror, growing in the retelling until they take on a life of their own? There are no definitive answers to these questions. What can be said with certainty is that the Darnell family existed, that they murdered dozens of people along a Missouri wilderness trail, that they operated for years before being discovered, and that they escaped justice except for one young man whose execution did nothing to bring back the dead or to provide closure for the families who never learned what happened to their missing loved ones. The rest, the question of what lingers in the hollow where those crimes occurred, must remain a matter of personal belief and individual experience. The scientists and skeptics will say that nothing remains but memory and suggestion, that any unusual experiences are the result of psychology rather than genuine supernatural phenomena. The believers will point to the consistent reports spanning 2 centuries, the refusal of animals to remain in the area, the way that even those with no knowledge of the history often feel uncomfortable in the hollow. Perhaps the truth lies somewhere between these positions. Perhaps places can remember trauma in ways we don't fully understand, ways that aren't supernatural but aren't entirely natural either. Perhaps the earth itself carries echoes of violence, chemical or electromagnetic signatures that sensitive nervous systems can detect without conscious awareness. Or perhaps the hollow is simply what it appears to be, an isolated patch of Missouri woodland that happens to have an unusually dark history. What cannot be disputed is that the hollow has a power over the human imagination that persists to this day. People who visit it, even people who don't believe in ghosts or curses, often come away with the sense that they have been somewhere important, somewhere that matters in ways that transcend its simple physical existence. Whether this power comes from the place itself or from the knowledge of what happened there is impossible to determine, and perhaps it doesn't matter. The effect is the same either way. A reminder that evil is real, that it has walked the earth, that it has left marks that time cannot entirely erase. The story of the Darnell family is, at its core, a story about the darkness that can exist in the human heart, about the capacity for cruelty that civilization barely holds in check. On the frontier, where civilization's influence was weak, where isolation and desperation created conditions that could transform ordinary people into monsters, the Darnells found an opportunity. They took that opportunity and used it to inflict suffering on a scale that is difficult to comprehend even 2 centuries later. But it is also a story about memory and place, about the way that history accumulates in specific locations, about how knowledge of past events can change our perception of present reality. The hollow, is physically unchanged from what it was before the Darnells arrived. The trees and rocks and streams are the same, but knowing what happened there transforms it into something different, something that carries weight beyond its physical properties. And perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps places where terrible things occurred should feel different, should carry some mark that warns the unwary, that reminds the forgetful. Perhaps the Hollow's refusal to become ordinary, its stubborn persistence in feeling wrong to those who enter it, serves a purpose. It keeps the memory of the victims alive in a way that historical records and academic studies cannot match. It ensures that the Darnells' crimes are not forgotten, not dismissed as just another frontier tragedy in a time when such tragedies were common. The final chapter of the Darnell story has never been written because it continues to unfold. Every person who visits the Hollow, who learns about the murders, who feels that inexplicable unease in the presence of the old homestead, becomes part of the story. The Darnells themselves are long dead, either perished in the wilderness or having lived out their lives under assumed names in distant places. Their victims are dust, their graves unmarked or so corrupted by time that identification is impossible. The physical evidence of the crimes has been scoured from the earth by a century and a half of weather and growth, but the Hollow remains, the story remains, the question remains. And on quiet nights, when the wind moves through the trees and the darkness settles deep into the valleys of the Missouri Ozarks, if you stand in that particular hollow and listen very carefully, some say you can still hear sounds that have no source. The ring of metal on stone, whispers in an unknown tongue, the scrape of shovels moving earth, the sounds of work being done in darkness by hands that should no longer exist. Are these sounds real, or are they echoes of echoes, memories so strong that they have impressed themselves onto the fabric of the place? Are they warnings, or are they simply the wind and the wildlife, ordinary sounds transformed by knowledge and fear into something more sinister? The Hollow offers no answers. It simply exists, waiting in the darkness between the ridges, keeping its secrets, preserving in its soil and stone the terrible knowledge of what humans are capable of when law and conscience are stripped away. It is a monument without markers, a memorial without names, a testament to victims whose only remembrance is the lingering unease that their deaths have left upon the land. The murder clan of Missouri, the Darnell family, killed dozens and vanished into legend. But their legacy endures in that hollow, in the stories that are still told, in the warnings that are still passed from one generation to the next. The road to nowhere, the path that so many travelers followed to their doom, is overgrown now, invisible beneath the forest floor. But it is still there, still waiting, and the hollow it leads to remains unchanged in all the ways that matter. This is what we know. This is what the documents and testimonies and physical evidence tell us. The rest, the question of what the hollow truly is and what might still linger there, must be answered by each person who encounters it. Some will see only trees and earth, will feel only the ordinary solitude of a Missouri woodland. Others will sense something more, will feel the weight of history and horror pressing down, will understand in ways that defy rational explanation that this place is different, that it remembers, that it holds something that death and time have not been able to disperse. The truth, as always with stories like this, lies somewhere in the space between fact and feeling, between what can be proven and what can only be experienced. The Darnell murders happened. The victims died. The family escaped. These are certainties. Everything else is interpretation, is the attempt of human minds to make sense of horrors that resist sense, to find meaning in randomness, to believe that such evil must leave a mark that transcends the merely physical. Whether such marks truly exist, whether the hollow genuinely holds anything beyond soil and stone, and the memories of those who know its history, is a question that each person must answer for themselves. But for those who believe, who trust their instincts and their senses more than they trust rational explanation, the hollow remains what it has always been. A place where the barrier between past and present is thin, where the dead are not quite silent, where the earth itself remembers violence and carries that memory forward into the present day. And so the story continues as it has for 2 centuries, as it will likely continue for centuries more. The hollow waits. The legend persists. And somewhere, perhaps in the darkness beneath that old concrete cap that covers the well, perhaps in the spaces between the trees where the cabin once stood, the echoes of the Darnell family's crimes continue to reverberate, too faint for most to hear, but clear enough for those who listen with more than their ears. This is the story of Murder Hollow. This is the legacy of the Darnell family. This is what happens when evil finds the perfect conditions to flourish, and what remains when that evil is finally, incompletely, driven back into the darkness from which it emerged. The hollow remains. The story endures. And the question of what truly lingers in that forgotten corner of the Missouri Ozarks hangs in the air, unanswered and perhaps unanswerable, a mystery that time has only deepened rather than solved.